Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now what I've got whizzing around in front of me is one of the Chindits. This fella here is from Warlord Games, and they were part of the 14th Army in Burma during the Second World War, often referred to as the Forgotten Army. Now the Chindits, I want you to imagine, if you've never heard of them before, they're actually very similar to the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS that would follow. They were lightly armed, lightly equipped, and their job was to go off into the wilderness and job the enemy wherever they could, causing maximum disruption behind enemy lines. They had a hell of a job. So their uniform is actually really easy to paint and nice and easy to get a bunch of them on the table very, very quickly. We're going to go back to some classic techniques here. Now it is worth pointing out that I'm going to use a lot of Army Painter stuff today, but if you do want to stick to Vallejo, if that's what you've got in your collection, I'm going to link in the description to a website which has the correct colors to use there as well. The method and the stages that I'm going to go through would be exactly the same, just substitute for the colors you might have in your collection already. All the same, those paints are listed in the description, so let's get started. So this fella, he is actually from the Chindit weapon teams. He is the assistant to the flamethrower, which means he's got a much easier job than usual today. Now, I've started off by priming him with Army Green from the Army Painter, and there's a very good reason for that. We're going to touch on the uniform briefly because the history of this is always a little bit interesting. Now, when these fellows were first posted out to Burma and to India, they were normally wearing the khaki drill, that beige uniform. And while it works perfectly well when you're trying to hide amongst sand, it is kind of a beacon when you're surrounded by green trees. And very, very quickly, they started dyeing them. So what it'll mean is that a variation in the colors is going to work quite well. Later on, and it didn't take very long at all, but there was a manufactured green uniform, the jungle greens, and they tended to be a little bit darker, a slightly more rich green than the dyed stuff, because that, by contrast, would fade very quickly. So priming them in army green, to be perfectly honest, you could leave most of the uniform in this color. It would be close to accurate. Any light, faded army man sort of green will work perfectly well. But by picking another couple of different greens and sort of mixing up shirts, trousers, and what have you, you can give your guys a more lived-in sort of appearance. So ordinarily you'll find that shirts tend to be lighter because they are washed more often, but there's nothing saying that you couldn't have a dude wearing a darker manufactured green shirt and then these army green trousers. It's up to you. Either will work. So our very first step is to grab some ruddy umber, and I'm going to use this to paint in his skin. Now ruddy umber is about as close as you can get to the old war paint tanned flesh. It's not exactly the same. This is ever so slightly lighter, but it works in much the same way. It covers very well as well. If I do need to, like once this first layer dries, if I see any of the primer showing through, I'll just come back and give this a second thin coat. Don't worry too much about hitting the rifles and what have you. Just if you are using green, the army green for his shirt, try and avoid hitting that as you apply this. Now 2 coats later, we've got our skin. We're going to move on to his trousers, and here I'm going to use Woodland Camo. Now ironically, if you've got the British historical colour set, then webbing green is a very good colour for this. Going on, it won't look too much different to the army green, but the beautiful thing is that it will cover very well, and it looks a bit darker once it's dried. And we're going to move on to painting his webbing and personal equipment, and for this I'm going to use olive drab. Now this bit comes with a history lesson, same as a lot of the painting. British issued webbing tended to be a raw canvas colour, and then what would happen is you would blanco it with a particular color. Now, blanco was originally like a chalky agent used to make leather personal equipment white. But when canvas equipment came along, instead what it was used for was to waterproof the equipment. And as the war went on, you would see the sort of beige blanco stuff change to green. And that's because it just better suited the environment. Whereas, if you go over to the 14th Army in Burma, a lot of their gear was being supplied by Indian factories, and they started out first. It was a sort of an ochre, yellowy color, but it would eventually be dyed a lighter green, like we're painting on here. So we get to use yet another shade of green on our army man. We have fun. So I'm going to finish off his equipment, first of all using this olive drab. Then for that deeper, more ochre yellow sort of color, we're going to use desert yellow. So this fella is probably undergoing a transitional period with his equipment, maybe 42, 43 or so. But I am doing this strictly so that I can show you the different colors. While that second coat dries, we'll spin him around, and with a little bit of leather brown, I'm going to paint in his water bottle. Now, while we are still painting the soft equipment on this fella, what I'm going to need to turn to is his hat. Now, for this, what I'm actually going to use is light battle dress. This is one of the ones from the historical set, and we'll paint over the puggaree here. Now, once this first coat is dried, it is definitely going to need a second one. And once that's dried, we can load up our brush with some mid-battle dress, and we'll apply that over the rest of the hat. Now, I tend to find it easiest to do hat bands, puggaree, and what have you first, because the shape of a hat will normally guide the brush where you need it to go. And now we can go all the way back to army green, and what I'm going to do is any tidy up that I need to around his collar, around his sleeves, and what have you. So once you've tidied up any of those bits that you need to, we're ready to go ahead and give him an all-over dry brush of ancient stone. So I've got a little bit on a large dry brush here. I'm going to work some of it off into a bit of kitchen towel. And it's important here that you've got next to nothing on your brush when you do this. So brushing along the edge of the base is a good idea to see what you're going to leave behind. Now, the idea here is to flick against any raised areas of detail. So trying to catch the edges of his pockets, the creases in his trousers, so on and so forth. I'm doing this with a dry brush because this light, sandy, dusty kind of color works well as a highlight for pretty much anything on a worn looking uniform. As well, it's fast. Good skill to practice. If you do prefer the slightly more polished finish, you want to highlight this a little more traditionally, it's really easy with the Army Painter range. You just pick the next highest green up, and it will work as your highlight color. But here, this is fast. Now at the moment, that's not going to look fantastic, but we're not finished. If you're worried that you have gone over anywhere a little bit more, like say there's a flat area that you don't like quite how much texture you've added, what you can do is go back to your base color and thin it down just a little bit more than you usually would, so it's slightly translucent. And go over that additional texture to tidy things up. Now I'd recommend against doing a lot of this. You don't really need to tidy this up as much as you would think, but any big splurges, you do have an undo button here. Now with that done, we're going to paint in the last few bits of remaining equipment. Now, I'm going to start here. This is rifle brown, and ironically I'm not going to paint the rifle with it. I am going to paint the sheath on his kukri. Now this is a beautiful color for like Garand's and what have you, the American rifles. I think it's a little more red than the Lee Enfield would be, but it is up to you. If you want to, you can start painting in your rifle with the same color now. And for the rifle itself, I'm actually going to use mud spatter. Now this is a nice medium brown. Go over all of the weapon. Don't worry about the black bits first of all. And if you want to, this is also a pretty good color for his hair. I'm going to do it in a darker color, but of course, if you want to swap it up amongst the troops, it doesn't hurt to have options. Now to fill in those black details, I'm going to use here strap gray. Now this one is from the German paint set. Ironclad gray from the John Blanche line is similar to this, but very slightly lighter. And there's nothing saying that you would have to use this. You could also use black as well. I just like something that's off black so that when we shade it, we do get a little bit of visual difference. All the same, anything that's going to be black, so parts of his weapon, his boots, and his hair, away we go with that now. Now the last thing I'm going to do before shading him is to get a little bit of brain matter beige, and I'm going to very carefully paint in his teeth across the top there. And I would suggest try not to use a pure white. because they will look a little funky Hollywood teeth. If you make a splurge over his top lip or what have you, you can just go back to his base skin color. Now to shade him, what I've got here is a mix of things. This is equal parts of strong tone, soft tone, and speed paint medium. Now strong tone by itself is pretty strong, it is very dark, but it's what I'm using for predominantly the shading effect here. And as well, the soft tone in there, having a little bit of yellowish warmth to it, goes very well over a predominantly green uniform. So we're going to make sure this is over the entire miniature. Really work it into the recesses. Don't just blop it on and hope for it to fall into place. Yeah, once this is done, we can go ahead and pop them in the sun somewhere, leave them to dry for about half an hour. And there, once that has dried, we have something that looks like this. Nice and simple, loads of shading, and the colors do stand out a little bit better from one another once that's done. I think the only thing I'm really going to do from this stage is to highlight his skin, because I always think that makes the miniatures look just a little more lively. So I've got agate skin. What I'm going to do with this is cover over most of the exposed skin, but leave just a little bit of the shaded stuff in the recesses to give us some depth. Then with some barbarian flesh, what I'm going to do is highlight the very edges of things like his hands, knuckles, along his chin, for example, cheekbones, just bring out a little bit more of the shape of the face. Now my camera did cut out for a couple of seconds, so you have mess where I've got just a little bit of skeleton bone and touched up around the puggery just to give that a little bit more texture. Not something that's strictly necessary, but I think it looks nice and it takes seconds to do. What I'm going to do now is take this chappy outside, hit him with a matte varnish, and I'll go ahead and pop his base on him too. And the recipe for that will be in the description. So let's get a look at our Chindit once he is all finished. And so there at last, our Chindit is complete. Now I have cheated a little bit because off screen I did pop a tiny wee bit of red tone into his mouth, just to give that a little bit more definition. And I have buffed a little bit of the metalwork with a number 2 pencil. Just a wee bit of slightly metallic finish over the top of the varnish, and it looks pretty cool once that's done. Now this will work for pretty much any of the jungle green uniforms, and I hope that if there's anything you take away, it's that the color of the green really isn't going to matter all that much. You can use, like I said, any army man style green with a wee bit of prep work is going to work just perfectly for these uniforms. So, as always, thanks goes out to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Thank you very much for your support, folks. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked down there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.